So I followed my son-in-law to be. Not because I was paranoid, not because I had some gut feeling that something was off. I followed him because my daughter sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped her with her grade 7 science fair project, where we'd eaten 1,000 Sunday dinners, and she told me, very calmly, that it would be better if I didn't come to the wedding. She said it like she was telling me the weather. "Dad, I just think it'll be less complicated." Less complicated. 41 years of being her father, and I had become a complication. I didn't argue. I'm not a man who argues. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, with a father who believed that a man's word meant more than his temper, and I have tried to live that way. So I nodded. I drove home along the 17, and I sat in my living room in the dark for a long time. My wife passed 11 years ago, lung cancer, even though she never smoked a day in her life. When you lose the person who made your house a home, you learn to sit with silence. I'd gotten good at it. But that night, the silence felt different. It felt like something had been taken from me that I hadn't even known I was still holding. My daughter's name is Paige. No, wait. I have to stop using the names that have already been used on this channel. Let me be clear with you. My daughter. That's what I'll call her. My daughter. And the man she was planning to marry, I'll call him her fiancé. And his father, well, his father is the reason I'm telling you this story. My daughter was 29 years old when she met him. She called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual because she usually texted, and she was laughing in that loose, delighted way I hadn't heard since before her mother died. She said she'd met someone at a work event in Toronto, a fundraiser for a children's hospital, she said. He was charming, he was kind. He had a firm handshake and remembered her name the next morning and sent flowers without being asked. I was glad for her, genuinely glad. For 6 months, she talked about him the way young people talk when they're sure they've found the right one. I listened. I asked careful questions. I wanted to meet him. She kept saying, soon, soon, soon. There was always a reason. He was traveling, he was busy. They were both so busy. Then she mentioned his last name. It was a Sunday call, and she mentioned it in passing, almost as an afterthought. She was telling me about meeting his parents for the first time. His mother was sweet, she said, very elegant. And his father was this well-known real estate developer, very established. His last name was Alderton. I didn't say anything for a moment. She kept talking. Something about the restaurant they'd gone to in Yorkville, and how she'd ordered the wrong wine and the fiancé's mother had been so gracious about it. I heard her voice, but I wasn't processing words anymore. I was back 22 years, standing in a parking lot in Mississauga in January in the cold, watching the doors of a building close on everything I had worked for. I said, "What's his father's first name?" She paused. "Martin, why?" I said it was nothing. Old memory, probably nothing. I kept my voice even. Martin Alderton. I had not said that name out loud in 15 years. Not because I'd forgotten it, because I had made a deliberate decision to stop letting it take up space in my days. There's a point where resentment just becomes a tax you pay on your own life. I know that. I believe that. I had moved on. But moving on, I was about to discover, is not the same thing as the past moving on from you. I should tell you what happened. 22 years ago, I was 43 years old, and I owned a small commercial flooring business in the Waterloo region. Nothing glamorous. Ceramic tile, hardwood, epoxy for warehouse floors. I had 4 full-time employees and a handful of subcontractors. I had just finished the biggest contract of my career, a new medical clinic in Cambridge, and I was being approached by a development group called Alderton Holdings about flooring work across multiple upcoming projects in Hamilton and Brantford. Martin Alderton was the face of it. He was maybe 10 years older than me, silver-haired, well-dressed in that expensive casual way that made you feel like he was doing you a favor by being in the same room as you. He had an office in downtown Hamilton with exposed brick and framed architectural drawings on the walls. He spoke about the projects with total confidence. Shovels were going in the ground in spring. Contracts would be signed after a brief due diligence period. He just needed commitment from his tradespeople ahead of time. A good faith deposit, essentially, to hold their spot. I should have walked away. I know that now. But I was 43 and hungry, and Martin Alderton had a way of making hunger feel like wisdom. I signed a letter of intent and wrote a check for $18,000. Over the next 8 months, 4 of my subcontractors did the same. One of them put in $35,000. He had a young family. He'd remortgaged. The shovel never went in the ground. The projects never existed. By the time we started comparing notes, Martin Alderton had dissolved Alderton Holdings, restructured under a new numbered company, and had lawyers sending letters about the unenforceability of letters of intent. The RCMP investigated. Nothing ever came of it. The civil suit cost me more than the $18,000 and ended with a settlement worth about 30 cents on the dollar. My business survived, barely, but it was never the same. 2 of my employees had to be let go. The subcontractor who'd remortgaged lost his house. He was a good man named, well, a good man. I think about him still. Martin Alderton, as far as I could tell, moved on to other things. That's what men like him do. And now his son was going to marry my daughter. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bed in Sudbury and stared at the ceiling and thought about what this meant. There are 2 possibilities when something like this happens. The first is coincidence. Canada is a big country, but the business world is small, and it's possible my daughter had simply, by some terrible accident of fate, fallen in love with the son of a man who had wronged me 2 decades ago. The second possibility was something I didn't want to think about yet. I waited 3 weeks. I asked my daughter twice more, very casually, if I could meet her fiancé. She said soon. The third time I asked, she told me, gently, as though breaking news to a child, that she didn't think it was a good idea, that he had a complicated family situation and she didn't want to create any tension before the wedding. I asked what kind of tension she meant. She said, "Dad, just trust me, okay? Some things are easier handled this way." That was when I drove to Toronto. I didn't tell her. I'm not proud of the deception, but I want you to understand my state of mind. I wasn't angry. I wasn't looking for a confrontation. I was a 64-year-old man who needed to know if the world was as strange and small and cruel as it suddenly felt, or if I was just a grieving widower who had become, without noticing, paranoid. I knew where my daughter worked. I parked down the street from her office building in the financial district on a Thursday afternoon, and I waited. She came out at 5:15 with a man I had never seen in person but recognized immediately. Not his face, his bearing, the way he moved through the street like he had already decided it belonged to him. He was maybe 30, dark-haired, well-dressed, laughing at something on his phone. My daughter took his arm and they walked west, and I followed them at a distance to a restaurant on King Street West, where they had a reservation and I did not. I ate a sandwich in my car. I watched them through the window for a while. He put his hand over hers. He laughed often. My daughter was luminous, the way she'd been when she was a teenager, and thought the world was fair. I thought, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's just a young man in love with my daughter, and his father's past is his father's past. Then a third person arrived at their table. He was older, silver-haired, wearing a shirt that probably cost more than my first car. He clapped his son on the shoulder and kissed my daughter on the cheek like he'd done it 100 times before. Martin Alderton. I sat very still in my car. I recognized him the way you recognize a road you almost died on. Instantly, in your body, before your mind catches up. He didn't look guilty. Of course he didn't. Men like Martin Alderton never look guilty, because they've spent so long reframing what they did that they've arrived at a version of events where they're actually the protagonist. He sat down and ordered wine and put his reading glasses on to look at the menu, and he looked like somebody's grandfather. And I sat in my car on King Street West and understood that I had a decision to make. I could do nothing. Walk away, let my daughter marry into that family, and spend the rest of my life at a polite distance. Or I could find out whether Martin Alderton knew exactly who my daughter was when his son started dating her. That question, that single question, was the one that kept me in Toronto for 3 more days. I'm a retired man with a modest pension and a strong Wi-Fi connection, and as it turns out, more patience than I'd given myself credit for. I spent those 3 days doing what I probably should have done the moment I heard the name Alderton. I started digging. Martin Alderton's current business was a property management company, legitimate as far as I could tell, operating mostly in the GTA and Niagara region. He had a website. He had a LinkedIn. He had a profile in a trade magazine from 2019 about his decades of experience in Ontario real estate development. The article mentioned his early career without mentioning the people who'd funded it with their savings. I found the numbered company from 22 years ago. I found the dissolution documents. I found the court records from our civil suit, which are public. And then I found something I hadn't expected. A note on a legal forum. Anonymous, but with enough specific detail that I believed it. From someone describing a similar situation. A contractor in Hamilton who had put money into an Alderton project around 2006. The same pattern. Good faith deposit. Letter of intent, lawyers. This had happened again. After me, after all of us. I sat in my hotel room near Pearson and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter than anger. A certainty. I called my daughter. She answered on the third ring, sounding happy. I said I was in Toronto and asked if we could have dinner. She sounded surprised but said yes, and we met at a Thai place on Queen Street that she liked. And for an hour and a half we talked about ordinary things. How her work was going. Whether she'd been back to Sudbury lately. I ordered the pad CU and she got the green curry, and it was completely normal until I set my phone on the table with the civil suit documents pulled up. She didn't look at the phone right away. She looked at me. I said, I know his name. I know his father. And I need you to know what I know before you make the decision you're about to make. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Dad, I know about the lawsuit. I hadn't expected that. She said her fiancé had told her that his father had made mistakes early in his career, that he deeply regretted them, that the family had worked very hard to rebuild and to do right by people where they could. I asked if her fiancé knew who she was, who her father was, whether the name connected. She looked at the table. He found out a few weeks ago. His father mentioned it. That's part of why we thought it might be better if. She stopped. I said, they knew. She said, Dad, please. I said it again gently, not as an accusation, just as a fact I needed her to hear out loud. They knew who you were, and they decided to handle it by keeping me away from the wedding, rather than telling you the truth and letting us all decide together. She was crying quietly. She's like her mother in that way. The tears come before the words. I reached across the table and held her hand. I wasn't angry at her. I want you to understand that clearly. My daughter was not guilty of anything except loving someone and wanting to believe the best of the family she was marrying into. That is not a sin. That is just being human. But I was going to go to that wedding. Not to cause a scene, not to make a speech. I want to be honest with you because this is my story, and I've carried it long enough that honesty is the only way I know how to tell it anymore. I went to that wedding because I was not going to be managed out of my own daughter's life by a man who had already taken enough from me. I went because if Martin Alderton was going to sit in the front row and watch his son marry my daughter, he was going to do it knowing that I was in the room. The wedding was in September, a venue outside of Burlington, one of those converted barn properties with string lights, and a catering minimum that probably covered my first house. 200 guests. A band that played soft rock during cocktail hour. I wore the suit I'd worn to my wife's sister's retirement party 3 years ago. Navy blue, white shirt, no tie. I stood near the back behind a cluster of people I didn't know, and I watched my daughter walk down the aisle. She wore her mother's earrings. I hadn't known she still had them. I held it together. Barely. The ceremony was short. The officiant was one of those friends who got ordained types, and he made some jokes that landed, and my daughter laughed, and her fiancé cried a little at the altar. And if I'm being honest with you, and I told you I would be, he looked at her the way I used to look at her mother. And that complicated everything. It was during the cocktail hour that Martin Alderton saw me. I had helped myself to a glass of sparkling water and standing near the edge of the patio when I felt someone stop a few feet away. I looked up. He was older than he'd looked through the restaurant window. The silver hair had gone fully white. He had the same careful posture, the same studied ease, but his eyes, when they found mine, were not easy. He knew exactly who I was. We stood there for a moment. He said, I wasn't aware you'd be here. I said, no, I imagine you weren't. He looked around the patio. Calculating, I thought. Counting the people who might be watching. I think it might be best if we kept the evening. I'm not going to make a scene, I said. That's not why I'm here. He waited. I'm here because she's my daughter, I said. That's the whole reason. That's the only reason. Something moved across his face. I don't know what to call it. It wasn't guilt, exactly. Guilt requires a reckoning with someone else's reality, and I'm not sure Martin Alderton had ever fully managed that. It was something more like recognition, the understanding that a thing he had arranged not to think about had arrived in person at his son's wedding. There was a man, I said, keeping my voice low, and even who remortgaged his house because of you. He lost it. His family, I've thought about that family for 20 years. Martin Alderton was very still. I'm not asking for anything, I said. I want to be clear about that. I'm 64 years old, and I'm not interested in what you can give me. I just want you to know that the people you took from didn't disappear. We kept living. We rebuilt what we could. And some of us, I paused. Some of us ended up here. I gestured at the party behind me. The lights strung across the barn, the tables being set for dinner. My daughter somewhere inside in her mother's earrings. He said nothing. His jaw worked slightly. I picked up my sparkling water, nodded once, and walked back toward the main hall to find my seat. My daughter had put me at a table with her friends from university. Good people, loud and warm and genuinely curious about who I was. I ate the salmon and danced badly once when they pulled me up. I gave a toast that was not on the program. I kept it short. I said that her mother would have been the most embarrassing person in this room tonight, in the best possible way, and that she was carrying something of her mother's tonight that I noticed, and that I was proud of her in ways I would never fully be able to articulate. She found me afterward, near the end of the night, while the band was playing something slow. She didn't say anything. She put her arms around me and held on. I held on too. Her new husband came and shook my hand a few minutes later. He looked, up close, like a young man who had been shaped by his father's money and was quietly not sure how he felt about that. I don't know his whole story. I don't know what he knew and when. Maybe that's a conversation for another day. But he shook my hand firmly and he said, "I'm glad you came, sir," and I believed him. I drove back to Sudbury the next morning. 4.5 hours on the 400 with a coffee from a Tim Hortons outside Barrie and the radio on low. I thought about 22 years. I thought about the man who'd lost his house. I thought about Martin Alderton's face when he saw me across the patio. The way a carefully arranged world can come undone by something as simple as a father showing up. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too. There was no moment where the score was settled, no version of justice that fully accounts for what was lost. But I sat in my living room that night, the same room where I'd sat in the dark after my daughter told me not to come. And it felt different. The silence wasn't a wound. It was just quiet. She called me on the Wednesday after. She was back from a short honeymoon in Prince Edward Island. We talked for an hour. She said things she hadn't said before. I said things I should have said sooner. At the end of the call she said, "I don't want you to be a stranger anymore, Dad." I said I wasn't planning on it. I'm not a man who believes in fate. I don't think the universe arranged for my daughter to fall in love with Martin Alderton's son so that I could have some cinematic moment of confrontation at a barn wedding outside Burlington. I think the world is random, and sometimes the randomness stacks up in ways that feel impossibly designed. But I'll tell you this. When my daughter told me not to come, I almost listened. I sat in that chair and I nearly decided that being a complication meant staying away. And if I had let them arrange me out of the room, I would not have had that slow dance. I would not have given that toast. I would not have seen her in her mother's earrings. I would not have been there at all. And after 22 years of Martin Alderton taking things from me, I was not about to let him have that.